So while the caffeine still has you in its iron grip, we will start the next session. I'm Paul Roth of the Philosophy Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. It's my pleasure, my honor to be chairing this session. Our first speaker will be Professor Shahzad Bashir, who is a professor of Islamic Humanities, holds positions both at Brown University and at Aga Khan University in London. And his most recent and much studied book is A New Vision of Islamic Past and Futures from MIT in 2022. Professor Bashir.
Great, thank you very much. So to begin, thank you to Zoltan and Arimas for the invitation and for being here. It's been lovely to hear the panel so far and to contribute to it. So my presentation is along the lines of trying to do something quite speculative. I understood the invitation to go haywire a little bit, so this is the direction I decided to go on. And thinking about the question of the future, and particularly the way the question is posed in the invitation, it suggests there is some place we are, and then the question is then what to do about it, right? So where do we want to go? So it's both about the future as an idea, but also our own future, both as academics, as citizens, and so on. So I understood it very much in that way. So what I started to do was to think about, well, what other possibilities or models of history that I'm familiar with that have always been kind of stuck in my mind to try to make something of. So the paper today is a kind of trying to play that out, something that has been knocking around in my mind for a good 10, 15 years, and this was just the right invitation to try to put it into words. So what I'm going to do is to take us through the notion of the cultivated garden as a time space. And so it is trying to work through a metaphor, and I'll try to explain where the metaphor comes from, how it works, and so on. But in a way, it is a try to move away from the use, in a very kind of a reductive way, to the use of lines for time. Certainly the timeline, which is a major metaphor, of course, that we use all the time, but also even a strata of time or sedimentation. The visual image behind that has to do with lines, right? So and even when we think of multiple timelines and so on. So I'm trying to figure out a way of thinking about time space that moves away from lines to something else. Now, there will be lines involved here too, but certainly the relational aspect of temporality, whether there is models to go there. Now, so there the question of the cultivated garden comes in, and so reading over materials, certainly written in Persian over the past about 1,000 years, but also in related languages, Arabic, Turkish, Urdu, Hindi, etc., in the area that ranges anywhere between Iberia and is the Indian Ocean in Southeast Asia. One of the things that keeps coming up in the titles of historical works, historical-geographical works, and that's why it's a time-space questions, is in the title that the authors will call their works gardens. There are many different words they would use, but the notion of the garden as an organizing principle for time-space is exceedingly widespread. So this is where the idea of experimenting with this to see how this works, and what I'm trying not trying to suggest that we adopt this, certainly, because the way where these things are produced, there's a type of cultural cachet to them, and which may not be available to us. So for me, it's more a question of the possibility of thinking about alternative metaphorical structures that we can use for time space. Now, there is in terms of theoretical grounding for this, we can think of this as a chronotope. That's one way in which people have thought about the use of such metaphors. Another way that is helpful for me is to think about someone like Blumenberg's idea of metaphorology, where for him, for the use of metaphors in philosophical discourse, he's interested in those metaphors that cannot be translated into conceptual language, that they do something in their own and then can be utilized for philosophical discussion, projection, and so on. So I'm interested in something similar with respect to historical work. Those metaphors, they can contain all kinds of things within themselves. And metaphors that, unlike the timeline, might be able to do some things that we want done, but where the timeline actually doesn't satisfy anymore. So that's the overall background to this. So I'm just going to go in three parts. One is to just talk about how does this metaphor actually work as a paradigm. Second, I will take you through a specific work written in 1820 to 1825 in South India, which uses this metaphor. And third, I will come back to the general questions that are of interest to us. Now, so first of all, the garden as an idea comes with a certain image in this world. So I'm going to show certain gardens here, but the nice thing about being here is that you can also just look through the windows and there's a garden, right? It's a very similar type of thing. But the notion of the garden has tremendous cachet in these parts of the world because of the climate and so on. And gardens, so the one that you're looking at here right now is a garden called Shalimar Gardens, built in the 18th century in the city of what is now Pakistan, in Lahore. There's an order to it. There's sections and so on. There's water flowing in various places. Now, this is a garden built on very, very flat land. So essentially, it had to be graded in a certain way, and then water had to be pumped up to be then flow down across to create this garden in a very arid environment. And as you can see here now, it's surrounded by a dense urban environment. Another garden that you can see here is something that I live very close to, which is a garden at King's Cross in London. And this was built in 2018. And this is the building I work in, which is a Center for Islamic Studies. It gifted this garden to the neighborhood, and it actually replicates these notions of what a garden does and how it is a communal space and so on. There's a garden, it's a 9-story building. There's a garden on top as well, which is replicating certain themes from gardens in Delhi, in India. So there is a kind of constant reflection of the physical gardens all over the place, from the medieval period unto the present. Now, the prototypical garden, where all of these are coming from in the Persian world, is a type of garden that is constructed on a mountain slope. So this is a very well-known one in Mahan in Iran. And so the idea is that there is a spring of water at the top of a mountain, and you build a garden on the slope, and you direct the channel from the spring down the slope. And then you bring these terraces and structures, and everything is then every bit of plants that is in there is very specifically planted to come up at certain time, to go down at certain times. It has a relationship to the fauna and that is around birds, other types of animals. It has a boundary, and in very hot places, when you go inside the garden, the temperature goes down by 5 degrees Celsius or something. So because it is this kind of haven type place that is created. So it has this a lot of cultural kind of legitimacy and cachet, both as an idea and also these physical gardens that are found all over the place. Now, so then the question becomes, well, how does this actually get used as a way of thinking about space-time? So there's many, many different examples. So what I have done is to basically created a kind of conspectus of how it does its work. So one of the reasons the garden is helpful for thinking about space-time is that it actually can account for the predication of human life on pre-given structures. There is non-human agency that has to be accepted in a garden. One, most importantly, predictably, is the seasons. And the gardens are planted with things so that it's green or other colors at different times of the year, right? So it's playing with the fact of the seasons in any given place, and that's why the gardens are built different in different places. But it is accounting for cycles of time, which is the seasons. It has to conform to the physical landscape, so topography as well. So topography thinking in terms of both the land, but also the flora and fauna that are there that have to be thought of and incorporated into the structure as it is built and maintained. And then it also has to account for contingency. Weather, earthquakes, pestilence, and so on and so forth. So some of these things are predictable and some are unpredictable. And the garden has to account for both of these in some way. So the reason this is helpful is because when we think of history, and if one is trying to account for the past, these are things that have to be taken into account. Certain things are predictable, certain other things are unpredictable. So the garden as a metaphor allows for the predictability and unpredictability and their co-presence in human experience. So that has to do with entirely extra-human aspects of human existence. Okay, so the next is the gardens have to be fabricated. A garden is not simply that is there already. Now, there's a metaphorical use where a city can be called a garden or a country can be called a garden and so on. But in terms of the way these space-time work in which garden is utilized, there's a very deliberate sense that a garden has to be fabricated. So there is human agency involved in the construction, cultivation, channeling, maintenance, and so on. So this is where the agency of the people that are being talked about in a space-time narrative, in a history, to use it kind of as a general thing, the garden can account for it. So if one says that history is a garden within which there is human agency to construct it in a certain way, to maintain it in a certain way, to let it become fallow, and so on and so forth. So ups and downs of states, peoples, dynasties, lifetimes, they can be incorporated in the notion of a garden. Similarly, what one finds often is that because these gardens are understood as being mapped in certain way and sectioned, that's often the way to use things about geography, different parts of the world or different parts of the garden, and then periodization. Sometimes there is a conversion of time into space directly, where it will say, well, this text is made of 8 gardens, and the 8 gardens are different periods of history, right? So there's a space-time conversion. Sometimes there's a use of space for space. Sometimes time is converted into space. Sometimes space is converted into time, and so on. And all of these possibilities are available and utilized. And then also is containment, right? So if one wants to write a narrative about space-time, it has to be contained in some way, as to the author will say, I will talk only about this, that, or the other, and not other things. And so the boundary of the garden is often utilized as well, or the boundedness of the garden. And then there is a question that history is a space-time text is a case of instrumentalization of narrative. So what exactly is one going to talk about? The topical selectivity that is the choice of the historian. which structures are going to be talked about, etc. So there too, because no garden is simply just, it's predicated on nature, but it's not actually natural. There's a way in which they will talk about sometimes topical selectivity. The other interesting thing is about the notion of a gaze, because when you're standing inside a garden, you can direct your gaze in different places. And there's one historian who specifically says that the world is this great garden, but what I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to regard all the previous histories that I've read as this great garden, but I'm going to create a new garden by picking flowers from these other gardens, which is based upon what I'm choosing to narrate, to find in terms of the historian's gaze and the historian's agency. And the garden is a hugely important poetic space in the languages, in Persian and other associated languages, in which the senses become very, very prominent. Sight, smell, touch, taste, and so on, because of fruits and so on. So there's a way in which all of those things, those aspects, existential aspects of being human, can be brought into the historical narrative through the use of the garden. So there, one can find within the history as going along, it's telling about the development of a state or something like this, and then suddenly there will be this section which is all about someone's experience or some kind of a personal narrative about their state of mind, their loves lost, and so on. So there's a way in which the garden allows for those types of excursuses to be built into a historical narrative as well. And then also, gardens were possessions for the people who had the wealth. So the ones that I showed you, the pre-modern ones, they're all built by rulers. Even the ones that I showed you in London is built by someone named the Prince Aga Khan. So they are markers of wealth, and they are political tools, just as any kind of writing of history is actually a political act and so on. So it can praise someone, it can denigrate, etc. By dissing other people's gardens, you can denigrate other people's history, competitive history. There's a lot of competition involved in all of this. Right? What has been interesting for me is to think about if one tries to ask the question, well, why exactly is the notion of the gardens used so much for this purpose? There is relatively little direct theorization. They don't explain why they're using it. So what you see here in this list that I have put together are things that are based upon my observation as to how they are actually utilizing. It's part of the literary and cultural world within which garden as a metaphor gets utilized. And I think its significance and its value comes from being able to actually hold all of these different functions together at the same time. And it is any given author's kind of choice as to which one to use, which one to not use, which one to emphasize, and so on and so forth, right? So it is. So there is a reason that this thing has persisted for, at least in one language, for more than 1,000 years as an idea. Okay, so that's the background. Now I'm going to take you through a text written that is called a garden, and it's described very much as a garden, that is produced between 1820 and 1825 in South India. The name is here. It's called Azam Jah's Spring. Azam Jah is the ruler to whom it is dedicated and who actually commissions it. So this is a very young man who becomes the ruler of a princely state in India in 1820. And he undertakes a pilgrimage from where he's resident, Chennai, or what is now Madras. What was Madras now is Chennai. And that's just a map of South India. And he takes a 50-day trip. He goes to the south one way and then comes back a different route. And so the interesting thing about this ruler is that he belongs to this dynasty called the Walajas. They are also called the Nawabs of Arcot. Now, they are an interesting local dynasty in that they are complete and abject servants of the East India Company. They basically sell themselves and their souls to the East India Company in like 1780s, quite early. And they're preserved as rulers, actually, on the basis of the East India Company. So to undertake this pilgrimage, he has to apply to the British governor of the region to even get the money. Even their household expenses have to be approved by the British resident. So they are a very interesting intermediate character of a type of Indian sovereign in this moment. Now, as they are completely politically dependent, even their succession is controlled entirely by the East India Company officials. They project themselves heavily as great sovereigns. And what they do is so these are two famous paintings. They have paintings of themselves done by European artists, and they send them all over Europe to project their presence. So the one on the right, where the single person is standing, this is a very famous one. And if you ever go to the British Library and work in the Asian Africa room, when you sit reading a manuscript, this thing actually looks down on you. So there's a very personal kind of experience that I've had a lot. And you can sort of see the finery involved and the projection of power and wealth, despite the fact that they actually are fairly, and they're very, very, very constrained. Now, the other thing that they do is to project power through symbolic means, and that this narrative about the garden that I will talk about is part of that projection. So this young man becomes to the throne, and he undertakes this journey, and very explicitly wants it written up as a garden of time and space. So that's where and now also the person who's writing this reads English, is well aware of European models of history at this time. And also at the same time when this is happening, there is new types of scientific ways of knowing that are coming into India in this place. And the same man also sponsors the writing of a new encyclopedia, which is explicitly stated as being counter or something that is alternative to what the Royal Asiatic Society is doing in London. So even though this is a very it's a text written in Persian in a model that is going back centuries, it is deeply connected to what's happening in India in the early 19th century. Now, the Nawabs of Arcot are significant enough that they occur in European history. They actually end up in at least one European treaty even, because of they project themselves. And very famously, Edmund Burke actually gave speeches in the British Parliament about the Nawabs of Arcot. So they are this interestingly contradictory figure of powerless but being present through certain types of projections that they make. Now, the text, to get to that, so it's called Bahar-e-Azam Jahi, the spring of Azam Jah. And it's, so wait, that's just so now its name is both a title and a chronogram. And what the author says is that he was a bureaucrat in the court. When they start to go on this journey, when the journey is authorized, so they start to go, and then he has a dream in which his teacher comes to him and tells him that in the future, when you write this text, you should call it Bahar-e-Azam Jahi, which is the name. And in the Arabic script, the letters have numbers, so there's a way in which you can create a chronogram. So it is the year in which the actual event takes place. So then because the text is about the past, but the past actually has a future which is coming from the outside, which is embedded in the author's self-description. And then the relationship between time and text is done through this chronogram, which is very, very common in this world, the use of chronograms rather than of numerical dates. Now, and then he says that what I'm going to do is to create a garden. And the first one is the introduction, which is the fresh flower. And so this is the presentation, because it's a presentation to the ruler to whom it's addressed and who asked for it. So the introduction, the textual introduction, is called the fresh flower as a gift. Then there are 4 chapters, which are called the 4 sectioned gardens. And they're called, so it's using different words for garden, which could all mean the same thing, but it's very specifically deploying them to have this sense of a garden and the inside of the garden and so on. And the four sectioned gardens are the 4 kind of stages of the journey. So it's time being converted into space. Then each garden has bouquets inside of it, and they're all told 50 bouquets, which is because the whole journey takes 50 days. So every day is a bouquet. The bouquets are in the gardens, in the section gardens, which are the chapters, which begins with this the presentation, and the conclusion is a flower bed, right? So it's a full spatialization of the 50-day journey. Into these different parts. So this is this is a relatively straightforward version of it. There are other texts in which the metaphor is taken much bigger and so on. Now, one of the things that we see here is that it's a 50-day period in which has been converted into gardens, but we also have universal histories going over 6,000 years that can do similar types of things. Bigger gardens, smaller gardens. Sometimes a day can be made into it. So there is immense flexibility in terms of using the metaphor for temporality. Now, so I'm going to leave this on the side. You may actually not necessarily need to see the screen just to kind of as a reminder, but then go through what exactly is this actually doing in the different parts. So one thing is the interesting part has to do with what exactly is it narrating. So one thing, as I've already mentioned, it is creating a structure, which is putting space-time that matters, that has been chosen to be narrated, into an ordered narrative. So the narrative, the garden is actually just a narrative. Obviously, it's not a physical garden, but it's this cycle between events, narrative, and the metaphor itself that is bringing the event together into the narration part through utilizing the structure of the garden. Now, the 4 chapters require moving between spaces. So they go from the home where he's based in Chennai to the saint's shrine that is being visited. And the saint's shrine is very, very important, popular, not just for South Asia, but actually it has a huge presence throughout the Indian Ocean world, etc. So it's a very, very well-known place where he's taking the pilgrimage to. From there, he goes to the grave of the originator of the dynasty to which he belongs, right? So there is a gathering of the religious authority and then the actual dynastic authority as to why he claims to be the ruler. And from there, he comes back. So those are the 4 chapters. Now, within the days that are part of the chapter, the crucial figure that stands in the middle is the body of the king himself, what he does. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. So it's the king's body that is moving day by day. And so the whole thing is on the focus of the king's on the body. What he does when he wakes up, what does he eat, and so on. So time is being gathered into the movement of the king's body and and because it's being correlated to the 50 days, so qualitative time, the time of the king's body, is being imprinted onto the calendrical time constantly because of the relationship in the structure and the qualitative aspect of the emotions and other types of sensations that the king is exhibiting. Ultimately, this text is actually mimicking a way of, it's an announcement of victory. Because he has just been accessed to the throne, and what he is doing by going through this travel is to basically proclaim himself king onto the domains that he claims. Ironically, he does not control these domains at all, but the only way to actually control the domains is through this journey and the symbolic narration of the journey as a garden. So through this, the state that he claims to have actually is turned into a garden through the narration that he's performing. So there's the symbolic aspect of the text. Now, going further, what is inside the text also is a description of the world that is actually met, of the visible world. So it's a survey. It actually adopts new principles regarding how the East India Company actually works in India, of describing animals, buildings, places, etc., tabulation as a colonial process. It basically adopts all of these things, but it's now being presented through this this metaphor. Now, there's a particular concern of differentiating between Muslims and Hindus. So this ruler himself is Muslim. The majority of the population of this area is Hindu. So there is a religious concern that runs through it, which is, and the interesting part, what of interest there is specifically the physical manifestation of the two religions, the temples and the mosques and shrines, etc. The Muslim shrines and mosques he goes into. The Hindu ones he notices but does not go into, because so there is a differentiation. Now, interestingly enough, there is a concern that comes up in the narration where it's represented that local people are coming and asking him to tell the Muslims not to go to the Hindu shrines. Implying, of course, that Muslims are actually going to Hindu temples and shrines. So the distinction between Muslim and Hindu in the actual lived reality is not very hard and fast. But the text is actually trying to perform that separation in a way. So there is an religious ideological function. Okay. It describes going through English, French, Dutch, and Danish holdings in this area. So it actually adapts. It's also a history of Europe in some ways, because all these four nations are present in this area, and it shows that wherever he goes, he gets different types of things from the four different powers, European powers, and the English are predominant, but the other ones are there as well. There's particular gifts to the families connected to the dynasty. And there is a particular concern for people who are insane, things that disrupt ordinary reality, who are somehow considered to be sacred. And so there is a way in which there is a kind of uncanny aspect that this is also trying to absorb. So these are living beings who have these types of connections. And then he has all kinds of parties and all food and things like this. So that's for the visible world. There is also a description of the invisible world throughout. And this is where he goes through the shrines that he meets on the way, but also the main one, where he has communion with the people who are dead. So the ghosts are present throughout as well. And because they're alive, and then he is the only one who can talk to them. So partly his claim to sovereignty is with respect to the buried people, and not so much the living people in some ways. All his genealogical predecessors, where they're buried. So there's a collection of the genealogy of the dynasty into his own being through the narration. There's a particular concern also for pointing out where miraculous things happen, things that disrupted any kind of normal causality, because that is part of the claim of sovereignty. So ultimately then, what we have is that we end up with this description of this garden is actually, it's a narration, it's a description of the visible world, and it is an acknowledgement of the invisible world, all done through essentially activating and operationalizing different aspects of the garden metaphor in the narrative itself, right? So this is an example then of a text very contemporary to itself. It's very aware of power and by a powerless person in some way, but operationalizing the metaphor. Okay, so that I will stop with the gardens with that. Now, ultimately, my interest in this is, as I said, can be utilized something like the garden or other metaphors, similar types of things that allow us to think of time-space in dynamic relationality rather than static lines or strata or sedimentation and so on. Because the garden is constantly moving, it's living, it's dying, it has to be constructed, maintained, and so on. So it allows what we see in these cases a very different way of approaching space-time than what occurs in the way we are conditioned at the moment to write our own histories. And so one of the other things, the idea of trying to go to some of these other metaphors is to move away from producing simply counter-narratives, right? So there is a way in which let's say a nation is predominant in narrative, and then someone who doesn't belong to the nation but lives in the same space can write a counter-narratives. That ends up replicating the same patterns. So one way to try to get out is to entirely change the terms by changing the metaphor that is utilized here. Then there's the thing of whether we can move away from, in terms of academic history, if we can do other types of experimentation. It seems to me that the issue that we are facing is not so much necessarily just directionality by itself, because there's all kinds of directionality in the garden as well. It's the hegemony of a certain vector of direction is what has come into question, right? So the garden allows for causation, directionality, etc., but without necessarily making it a single hegemonic way of enforcing a certain form of history. And then ultimately, history is political and aesthetic as much as anything else. And so there too, whether metaphors, other metaphors can be utilized to write other forms of history is kind of why I find this, I found this interesting to at least to play with. And I will stop with that. Thank you.
Questions? Thomas?
Thank you very much for this presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I have a question regarding, so to say, conceptual relations and what is the position of the garden. First of all, the garden is a basic or kind of paradigmatic figure for historiography in this region, but I'm wondering what is beyond the garden, or what are figures alternative to the garden? Is it, for example, steppe? Is it desert, jungle, mountains, maybe ocean, or something else? Yeah, I find the garden as a metaphor of order. So what is the chaos beyond this order? I find it very interesting. Thanks.
Thank you. So because when it is used for narration, its investment is in the order. So this is what comes up. So what ends up being the other to it is that which is not to be covered in the garden, right? So what will happen is if someone is like, this person is narrating that this is the garden, the histories of the other people who are living in the same space, that's the jungle. That's not part of this garden. But they don't actually fully metaphorize it. They're mostly just concerned with the just concentrating on using the garden as a structure. Now, but a different part of this is that there is other metaphors that are used as well, not as prevalent. The idea of time as a building is quite common. And so there's other types of spatializations that they do as well. But again, the concern is how to manage the structural element of it, and not necessarily to see the outside of it.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. What do you think that it is the difference and the advantage from your last book about the relational time at this presentation about garden? I took that you, in the garden metaphor, the agency, the human agency, is mixed with summer agency and the ground and something else. But I want to know your opinion about it.
Yeah, so that's a good question. In a way, it's kind of steps in my own kind of thinking. I think when I was writing that book, I was really just concerned with using some kind of a metaphor that allowed me to make that argument that I was making. And so therefore, the notion of a web constructed by the historian made sense. This is bringing in the extra human agency much more. So in a way, I find like the text like this is actually richer than what I produced.
Yes, but the last book you have to a web designer that represent better the relational time. And in this occasion, you present a narrative one. Don't you think that the web...
Okay, yeah.
Are you realizing my point?
Yes, I do. So in a way, if one were to utilize the garden metaphor, it would have to be other than the way they are actually using it. So absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
So this is a uncharacteristically straightforward question because in your the way you operated, it was mostly on the level of exegesis. You told us a lot about what's being done, what's happening, and I am really curious, just from a position of ignorance, more about sort of genre. Do you think this is there? It sounded sometimes like travel narrative, but then other times it seems like what's at work is ekphrasis. That we're given. I mean, I'm curious about that. About sort of the movement. Is there movement in the narrative, and then also through the descriptive mode, and what that does, and then how that relates to the way you've explained it to us.
Yeah, so in a way, I think it exists more as a motif to be deployed in many different ways. So you can have ekphrasis in a very similar mode, or it can just be about time, sometimes space-time, sometimes only space. So it seems to be this kind of a complex set of ideas that are available to be deployed in many, many different ways. Now, also I should say that there's no direct theorization of this in the material itself. So the claim I'm making that this is what they're doing is actually my own reading of, based upon having read so many. So it's almost like just there somehow in the cultural world. There's a whole one on melons of time. I mean, there are all kinds of different possibilities. Yeah.
Thank you. That was, yeah, it was very enjoyable, your presentation. I had two questions related. One is, do you think it's possible that the author made the choice of this garden metaphor partly because if the Nawab's power was so constrained, he could not create like a Shalimar gardens, you know, he doesn't have that. So to kind of fulfill that imperative and that way of projecting Nawabi power with this literary garden that captures an ephemeral kind of journey where he was able to project his presence. That was the first question. And the second one, gardens at the end of the day, they are, because it's cultivation, the word cultivation is so close to development and improvement in some ways. Do you think, this is where I'm just, would love your opinion, do you think there's a risk that are there ways out of a developmentalist or progressive form of storytelling with this metaphor?
Thank you. Both great questions. So on the first one, it's very likely, as you're suggesting, that it was a symbolic garden. I think where it becomes a little bit more is that those who did construct the great gardens also have the texts called gardens. So there is a kind of translatability across. Now, one other part that brings this up is that they can't critique the East India Company directly, but a lot of what is the way the things is sequenced, there is a lot of critique. So there is an undercurrent of political resistance that they're utilizing this one. Now so the second question you have with respect to, so I think there is certainly a sense of a contained area that is cultivated, that is managed, and so on. But I think it's the where it doesn't become fully developmentalist is that there is a predication on the environment. You can control what you plant, and you can trim it, etc. But the reason it grows there has to do with the land and so on. So there is an interesting back and forth with respect to the limits of human agency. Yeah, and then so then it's it's particular to particular places and so on. But the other part of it is there is an investment in the notion that to maintain a garden requires an immense amount of work, to create one and to make one. So in that way, it's the historian's agentive act to create history is very much there. So history is just not out there. You have to create it just like you create a garden. And that is a quote-unquote civilizational project. Yes, that is very much embedded in many of these things. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. While listening to it, I couldn't help but think of another garden, the Garden of Eden, in the Old Testament, and in particular, also which, to my knowledge, in the Islamic tradition is simply called the garden, Jannah, and it's opposite Jahannam, which is sort of a play of words on Jannah, even though it has no etymological connection, I would argue. Is this eschatological element present also in these garden timelines, or in the tradition of garden writing, or is it completely unconnected?
No, it's very much present, and the use of words, because of lack of time, I didn't want to go into that. But the reason the motif is so significant is because you can rely on all kinds of religious things there. And what is utilized is one, the Garden of Eden in terms of Genesis. It's not eschatological, but it is actually creation of the Garden of Eden on earth. It's the power of the historian to create here and now the resurrection. That is very, very much there. So it's not eschatological in the sense of projecting the end of time, but the ultimate place to be here on earth in this time, yes, it can be done. So it's this worldly paradise.
Yeah, well, thank you, Shahzad. If I would like to push you a bit further, then I would ask you to, answer all 4 questions. But I will skip that part. I would like to zoom in on one, only about directionality, because I think that the way that you phrase the question is, of course, is based on the assumption that the way we think about history is based on the way we think about our life histories individually, and of course, there is this structural difference between history as, the big collective thing and, life histories as, the deeply individualized sort of, based on experience. So, and then the question would be whether, do you think that there is a way to somehow link with this garden metaphor to, or sort of strip it off from individual experiences and just look at it from the outside in a way, and how that would sort of relate or create something other than directionality? Or is there some possibility to go into that direction in answering the question, to the link history from individual life histories, or the way that we think about history?
So I think so. Especially one kind of, if one strips away from the examples that I'm utilizing to create this, and one looks at simply just the abstraction of it, I would say absolutely yes, right? Because the human can actually just become another animal inside the garden, right? So it's definitely possible. But I think there's a larger issue, though, with respect to non-agentive or non-human history, in the sense that we as human beings are making these projections. How does one get the human out of history? Is something that I'm not really. Because even when we are struggling with the question of moving away to different metaphors of history or different ways of thinking about the past and the future, it seems to me that the ultimate concern is the human, right? So I have some difficulty. I've had difficulty with where history is told only, let's say, through a germ or something like this, because ultimately it's a human product, right? So this is where I'm not really sure about the
Well, I do not necessarily mean that you, of course, need to write off the right human out of the picture or something like this. That it has to be also non-human history, or both human, non-human, and so forth. I'm thinking about more of this. Let's say, when you read phenomenologists about history, then they always reduce the collective, big concept of history to the level of individual experience. So I'm just wondering whether if you can, the structural difference, or is there a structural difference between life histories, which have the directionality, toward that or whatever, and whatever. So again, you as a human person will be the one who conceptualizes history, right? So that you cannot strip it off, and that's not necessarily the point. But the way you conceptualize the collective, and the way which doesn't necessarily based on individual experience. So the question is whether can that help to answer the question of directionality, or just to strip it off the big collective concept of history from directionality, if you sort of emphasize a difference between the structure of individual life experience and the structure of a certain concept of history which is not grounded in individual life experience?
Very good question. So, I don't see any impediment to be able to do that. But one of the interesting things is all the examples that from which I'm deriving, they don't do that. Yeah, they don't have this kind of, in a way, like aggregationist, social aggregationist aspect of. They do bring it to the individual body's experience and so on. But whether that fits or not, yes, that's a very good question. I think that's something to think more about.
I'd like to have the last question, if not the last, leave the last word to you. But it seemed to me in the build-up to your talk, what I heard was talking about gardens as both natural and constructed, both the made and the found. And typically these are thought of as oppositional terms. And I wanted to sort of hear more from you about whether part of the message here is this is a false opposition, that there would be no order, there would be no structure, even to a natural object, without the human hand, but that doesn't mean it's been falsified or fully created. Sort of an epistemic way of unpacking the metaphor. I just want to know what you reacted to that, how you reacted to that.
Thank you. No, yes, absolutely. That's precisely why I find their use of the garden interesting, in the sense that, like, for example, a building doesn't work the same way, right? Because that is all. But here, in a way, I feel like it allows accounting for radical contingency while also accounting for structuration and so on.
Okay. Well, let's thank our speaker then. Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Javier Fernández-Sebastián. He's a professor of history of political thought at the University of the Basque Country. He's well known for his work in the theory of history and conceptual history, and most recently has published the book Key Metaphors for History, Routledge, 1924. Professor Fernández-Sebastián.
No, it's just a quotation. Thank you for your for your.
Oh, I thought you'd introduced the wrong person.
No, this is my starting point. Just I'm not Michael Frieden, but Fernández-Sebastián. Thank you, Paul, for your kind words of introduction. Thanks to the organizers, especially to Rimas, Sultan, and Tatiana, for to the opportunity of discussing issues that interest to all of us. And thank you, all of you, for your presence. So in one of his latest articles on some recent transformations in the study of ideologies, Michael Frieden wondered whether nowadays, rather than dealing with ideologies per se, we have to be ready to gather up their pieces. Ideologies, Frieden argued, are now in pieces, dismantled, fractured, sporadic, discontinuous, even scavenged. This is quite recent. This is the last year. Yes. This academic reflection, so symptomatic of the times we live in, gives me a starting point to emphasize, from a metaphorological perspective, the fractured and stable condition of today's world. Whereas in the heyday of triumphant Western modernity, compact ideologies supported by one or another historiography provided their followers with clear guidance on the meaning, direction, and goal of history, those schemes ceased to work some time ago. We have entered an era of uncertainty and fragmentation, which, when it comes to history and temporality, is also an era of disorientation, of a lack of clarity about the course to follow. In this talk, which extends some of the concerns and questions I raised in my book, Key Metaphors for History, I shall focus on a handful of tropes alluding to the hesitations characteristic of this particular historical moment. For, as we learn from Hans Blumenberg, mentioned also by Shahzad, a few key metaphors play a crucial role in navigating the realities in which we live, since upon them depend the shifting horizons of meaning within which concepts undergo their modifications. And since the key metaphors of an epoch indicate the attitudes, certainties, conjectures, and expectations of that particular historical moment, The small exercise of topological analysis that I propose will, so I hope, allow us to glimpse the feelings of unease and uncertainty that unsettle present Western societies when what is at stake is the historical time we are living through. I would say that some of the most conspicuous metaphorics have to do with fragmentation, acceleration, bewilderment, and turbulence. For over 2 centuries, metaphorics related to fragmentation seem to capture certain key features of the modern world. The earliest complaints against the individualistic atomism that would have displaced the hierarchical order of the Ancien regime are to be found in the work of some reactionary thinkers. Equating post-revolutionary society with a shapeless heap of sand, tas de sable in French, became a topos of post-French Revolution thought. This motif was taken up again and again throughout the 19th century by numerous authors of the most diverse tendencies in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. John Stuart Mill, for example, wrote in the Edinburgh Review in 1840 that, I quote, "The members of a democratic community are like the sands of the seashore, each very minute and no one adhering to any other," unquote. In some conservative quarters, there is an evident nostalgia for a lost world, supposedly more tightly knit around a body of shared beliefs. In this regard, I found it telling that the word fragmentation is, in English and in other European languages too, began to be used in the early 19th century. And it may not be useless to recall that the words fragment and fracture derive from the Latin verb frangere, which means to break or to shatter. Implicitly, then, both terms refer to the idea of totality, insofar as they evoke the previous whole that has been broken. In other words, if there are fragments, it is because before the fracture, there was a whole and intact object that has been broken. Thus, whether or not we have a synecdoche, the pars always speaks to the totus. As in the hermeneutics circle, the fragment is dialectically inseparable from the totality. The meaning of the part depends on the whole, even though it is equally true that the whole cannot be understood if we do not take account of the parts that compose it. But do not think that we are talking only of nostalgic reactionaries and liberals. Socialists and anarchists will not cease to denounce the evils of a pulverized society, which precisely for that reason, they claim, will soon be ripe for the definitive revolutionary assault that will overthrow the capitalist order. The classic of late 19th and early 20th century sociology would likewise show their concern for certain ills of modern society: social disarticulation, individualism, anomie, very similar to the ills denounced decades earlier by the French counter-revolutionaries. In the 20s and 30s of the last century, the image of fragmentation made a strong comeback in Europe and the Americas. Not by chance, Philip Blom, in his book on the Western world in those 2 decades, chose the image of fracture to describe the interwar Western culture. Erich Hobsbawm, for his part, extended this diagnosis to the entire 20th century, a period that the British historian characterized as a whole as a century of cultural fragmentation. In Modernity and Ambivalence, Zygmunt Bauman highlights the degree to which modernization has so fragmented the relative cohesion of pre-modern society that stability under modernity paradoxically lies in its very instability. This imaginary seems to have reached its paroxysm in recent decades. According to its harshest critics, in our late modernity, we have moved from fragmentation to decomposition. David Roberts, for example, following Michel Houellebecq, gives a grim description of the atomized contemporary society. Our society, says Roberts, is composed of monadic and clonal individuals, elementary particles that form anomic crowds detrimental to the social body, as occurs with the disorderly and destructive growth of cancerous cells. Contemporary ultra-individualism would thus result in something worse than a heap of sand, namely a fatal social cancer. This hyperfragmentation or hyperfragmentation is present in almost every sphere, from society and politics to urban planning, literature and art, not excluding history and temporality itself. And its metaphors adopt a number of variants: explosion, archipelago, constellation, galaxy, puzzle, mosaic, collage, each with its own implications and peculiarities, depending on whether they stress irreparable dispersal or the possibility of resembling the disjecta membra together so as to reintegrate them into a whole. One of the most evocative metaphors for describing ideological fragmentation is that of a shattered mirror. In this image, ideologies appear as reflecting mirrors that once offer consistent vision of society and culture. Political ideologies such as socialism, conservatism, or liberalism provided frameworks for understanding the world and interpreting political realities through a more or less reliable lens. However, globalization and identitarianism that has followed the crumbling of traditional class structures have shattered these mirrors, leaving behind fragments that no longer offer unified and coherent visions. Instead, each fragment reflects a partial, distorted view of reality from multiple conflicting perspectives. These fragmented reflections, so characteristic of today's politics, refer both to the difficulties of achieving consensus within each country on a few fundamental issues, and to the strange alliances that day in and day out surprise us in global geopolitics. Suffice it to recall here the back and forth exchanges between the US and Russian presidents so far this year. This mosaic metaphor can be applied to populist movements that opportunistically incorporate diverse, even contradictory claims. Some analysts have spoken of patchwork ideologies, which everyone puts together to their own taste. In this atmosphere of ideological centrifugation, we come across strange and disquieting phenomena, such as the controversial and classifiable Slovenian musical group Laibach. Two of their albums with titles as evocative as We Are Time or No History particularly caught my attention, or certain tiny American communist groups who in the latest United States presidential election publicly called for a vote for Trump. Let me now briefly address the issue of temporality. At the beginning of if on a winter's night a traveler, widely regarded as one of the first examples of postmodernist narrative, Italo Calvino contends that temporality appears to have exploded. I quote, the dimension of time has been shattered. We cannot love or think except in fragments of time, each of which goes off along its own trajectory and immediately disappears, unquote. And it is not without disquiet that some of these images are not very different from others related to the convulsive interwar years. Germany's Ruth Kluger, recalling her childhood under the Nazi regime, writes something similar. I quote, time was splintered. I didn't experience it in as a continuity, but rather as a heap of broken glass shards cutting into your mind when you try to put them together, unquote. Speaking of shards, sorry. This is the correct slide now. Some of the tallest and most iconic buildings in 21st century Europe seems like visual metaphors of our time. I am referring, of course, to the skyscraper known precisely as the Shard, one of the most recognizable elements of London's skyline. Its jagged glass silhouette seems a crystalline monument to fragmentation. Taller still is the tower of the Lacta Center in St. Petersburg. This, with its twisted needle shape, and in its vicinity, it is worth noting 3 large flagpoles were erected together 2 years ago, bearing their flags, the current flags of the Russian Federation, the flag of the Russian Empire, and the flag of the Soviet Union. The strong nationalist symbolism implicit in that ceremony, provided over by Vladimir Putin, constitutes a visual epitome of the kind of ideological syncretism or patchwork I mentioned a moment ago. The straight line was an icon of modernity, wrote Tim Ingold almost 20 years ago, opposing it to the broken line of postmodernity. Let us remember that the root of the word direction goes back to regere, which means to follow straight. If the quintessential geometric form of modernity consisted of moving in a direction, which presupposed being oriented, our current situation can be described as directionless times, a phrase that not only implies disorientation, but adirectionality. If we consider the so-called C theory of time, we will see that the absence of direction goes hand in hand with fragmentation. According to this philosophical theory, we will have a series of unconnected events ordered by temporal betweenness of some with respect to others, but with no distinction between past and future. One of the most fitting everyday metaphor for grasping the automation of time is the notion of infinite scrolling, typical of platforms such as Instagram, X, or TikTok. A concept born 2 decades ago based on the uninterrupted flow of new items that stimulates our desire for exploration and novelty, while submerging the internet user in a seamless browsing experience and endless content discovery. The infinite scroll design pattern is not only addictive, but lacking clear boundaries between perceived text and images. It distorts our perception of time and destroys any sense of continuity. Past and future dissolve into an eternal now. The lack of clear narrative progression mimics the postmodern experience of history as a flat present without depth or causality. The platform's interface, with its endless scroll of posts, creates a temporal collage where historical events, personal anecdotes, and memes coexist without hierarchy. The visual metaphor of the endlessly refreshing feed parallels the feeling that history is not progressing, but spiraling. We have entered, right and Fuchs, the era of the fragmented now, bereft of past and future. Other visual metaphors in which we are immersed, such as the 24 hours news cycles that prioritize immediacy over context, likewise reinforce this fragmentation. Both social media and the split screen format of new channels that present multiple, often contradictory, fragmented narratives simultaneously, and even the workings of generative AI based on the cutting and pasting of information for its training inputs can be seen as visual allegories from the collapse of narrative time. Both the tropes used to emphasize the lack of temporal direction are, in these times of uncertainty, highly varied. At times, they consist of the radical redescription of some hackneyed tropes of modern temporality and historicity. Broken lines, runaway horses, derailed trains, time auto-join, the history as arrow without a target, and when these images seem too rigid, linear, or mechanical, carving loop-shaped fluid figures endowed with greater dynamism come into play. We then speak of dazzling circles and spirals, raging rapids, quicksand, tectonic shifts, formidable cyclones and storms, whirlpools or vortices that violently shake the waters of the river of the ocean of history. In literature and the visual art, we found a multitude of images that appeal to urgency and drama, and scholars of history theory, including some distinguished one present in this room, draw on a variegated metaphorical palette that also touches on fragmentation, discontinuity and disruption, surprise and unease, extreme volatility and temporal overlaps. Alongside all of this, we might consider the use of forms and images such as networks, rhizomes, folds, palimpsests, kaleidoscopes, fractals, or tentacles, specifically alluding to semi-drained strata, motley colors, surprising mixtures, games of regularities and irregularities, unexpected multi-directional extensions, and sudden change of course or perspective. When the metaphorics of flow combine with those of fragmentation and turbulence, suggestive images are sometimes produced. Reinhard Koselleck compared the state of temporal confusion after revolutions to various pieces of clothing or different fabrics and colors mixing chaotically in the washing process. I quote, "It is like the glass front of a washing machine, behind which various bits of the wash appear now and then, but are all contained within the drum," unquote. This image came to my mind while looking at the poster of our convention, an iconographic motif that seems to symbolize the state of a hyper-accelerated society like ours that has long faith in progress and where history lacks a telos. the social historical washing machine, spins at full speed, but always with the same clothes in the drum. In this case, the items of laundry would be us. Hartmut Rosa labeled the situation with these two words, frenetic standstill, expressed with a perhaps more familiar image. We are all running hastily inside a hamster wheel, but without advancing a single millimeter in any direction. We live at once in a turbulent, troubled, and turbid world, or what amounts to the same thing as the Latin roots of this sector of the vocabulary suggest, a world full of problems, disturbed, against, agitated, restless, muddied, and confused. Fragmentation has gone so far that it seems to be breaking up the great collective singulars forged by the beginning, at the beginning of modernity. Indeed, there is good reasons to wonder, as Nikolai Koposov did a few years ago, whether in our age of fragmentation we might be witnessing a kind of subtle side in reverse. I mean that in an increasingly particularistic world, the great collective singulars of modernity are quietly dissolving before our eyes. As ideologies fragment and such basic concepts as history, progress, or future dissolve, the Koselekian theorem of ideologization seems to have been turned upside down. With the crushing and centrifugation of ideologies, we would be living in an age of particularization, which would be the reverse of the great age of singularizations which Odo Marquardt dealt with. The world, observed Koposov, I quote, is being seen as more I forgot to put this. It's been seen as more particularistic because of the fragmentation of our world view. And he adds, as a result of the current fragmentation of history, basic historical concepts are no longer singular collective names and are returning to their pre-Satellite origin, unquote. In another of his texts, Koposov himself has written that in this time of cult to memory and identity, the past, I quote, appears as no less politically biased and clearly more fragmented than the old past that was structured around master narratives. In a way, this fragmentation is even increased, has even increased the likelihood of its being used for the purposes of political manipulation, unquote. In discussing the historian's task, Herbert Butterfield spoke of, I quote, a few fine flashes of light that break through the darkness in the midst of a heap of broken fragments, unquote. That is to say, we must not despise the cracks or the fragments, since both can be productive in terms of knowledge. In his album, The Future, in the early 90s, Leonard Cohen delivered this message. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. To conclude this paper with a touch of optimism, applying the hopeful verse of the Canadian songwriter to our subject, I would say that it is possible that through the interstice opened in fractured ideologies, some rays may filter through to shed new light on the serious problems of our time. While Virginia Woolf felt she lived in an age of fragments, today there is a high degree of consensus among different theorists that we live in an age of fragmentation. What is certain, however, is that even this so-called our time, that is the very concept of the epoch itself, has been fragmented and called into question. The notion of epoch has cracked and threatens to fall into ruin. Just as there is not one but multiple times, no one but multiple pasts, and no one but multiple futures, several authors have raised their voices against the modern concept of epoch born in the time of the French Revolution. Our age, wrote Thomas Bernhard, has long been intolerable as a whole. Only when we perceive a fragment of it, it is tolerable to us, unquote. Our situation is a heterogeneous mix of discordant tensions, and it is not appropriate to think of it as an age, asserted for his part the Argentinian Ignacio Lekovich. So there would be no such thing as the zeitgeist. The age, concludes a well-known German graphic designer, has no spirit. I said at the outset that fragmentation is a very apt metaphorical framework for describing what is happening in our time. It would seem indeed that it is. So much so that accelerated fragmentation has ended up cracking the very concept of the epoch, which was one of our starting pillars. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ethan?
So let's see if I can form this in the phrase it in the form of a question. But I guess I'll start with it strikes me that the metaphor of the fragment, I think, is an interesting one. But as you stated it, there's an assumption at play in the metaphor of the fragment, and that there was a whole that has somehow been broken, and so that then, in a way, sort of determines what's going to ensue in terms of the criticism of the state of history, and even the possibility of reclaiming the sorts of grander narratives, let's call it. But in many ways, so much weight is placed on that metaphor itself. If we don't think of the logo for this conference as a washing machine, which is a kind of labor-saving modernist device, but think of it as a black hole, then of course, that's a different understanding of what it's doing to time and space. As yes, it may not be allowing us to have our comforts of 20th century industrialization and progress, but it is forcing us to think about different configurations. So the question is whether we could imagine something like discontinuity without having to also impose fragmentation. So this is to say, maybe there never was a whole out of which then now we've lost it. That was just an organizing kind of metaphor before, and now that we're disenchanted with it, or if we're disenchanted with it, perhaps then we would need a different organizing metaphor that would get us out of the stall that you're worried about. So do we have to go back to fragmentation implying a whole, or is there something else that can jumpstart the malaise that you've diagnosed?
Okay, thank you, Ethan, for your very insightful and interesting question. Yes, in a way, I think that fragmentation could be understood as a metaphor, or as a metaphoric set of metaphors coming from very old times. In this sense, you have right that the very concept of fragment implies a kind of something complete before to be earlier to be broken. So, but in my view, there are some moments in history that this metaphor come into the fore, and even from a quantification point of view is really, I remember I was talking with a colleague specialized in the Reformation, the early modern times. He mentioned that fragmentation was also, for a while, an important metaphor after the Reformation in Europe, because when in history something happened that break up the previous situation, and of course another big moment is French Revolution. After French Revolution, all, in particular reactionary, but not just reactionary people, tend to emphasize the fact that this is not just fragmentation, but atomization of society, and the destruction of hierarchical order is equating with the destruction of the order tout court. So, but in my view, this modern trend of affirmation of fragmentation as some important motif in metaphors of modernity is very, very strong, accelerated in these last decades. Even from just an analytical point of view, you can see everywhere, and this period could be qualified as hyper-accelerated, hyper-fragmented. So it's not just a question of fragmentation, but even decomposition, disintegration. So it's an emphasis, a very strong emphasis in this. The other thing you mentioned about the black hole, it's true that black hole is probably closer to your vortex, because in a way a black hole destroys time, destroying many things, but including the physics time, in the sense that yes, even the relative times is destroyed because absorb everything, including space, time, etc. No? So it's probably is probably even stronger than fragmentation, the black hole. But at the same time, it's very useful for your approach, in the sense that this vortex creates a kind of complex interrelation between different so-called ecstasies of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can trace this problem of fragmentation really deep down. I am very much interested in this recent development that you just mentioned, because, as we all know, the fragmentation and the fragment was one of the basic metaphors of postmodernism that symbolically ended with 9/11. And when you were delivering your talk, I was thinking what really changed in this problem of fragmentation over the last 25 years after the paradigm shift from postmodernism to posthumanism. And my question is about confirmation of disconfirmation of my opinion about this matter. I think that fragmentation and decomposition become not primary negative ideas.
Sorry?
Not primary negative ideas.
Okay.
For example, because we have the dominance of ecological humanities, from ecological point of view, there is nothing better than decomposition. There is nothing better than fragmentation of organic matter. When you talk about critical heritage studies, people like Rodney Harrison, Caitlin De Silva, they are talking about decomposition and fragmentation and ruination as a positive process. We don't need to save everything. So there is no future of heritage without the ruination, which is something that we have to let go. So my question is about your approach, because it might be also a generational thing. You know, I was really raised by Hayden White about this idea of fragmentary history as something that contradicts great narratives. And I felt that this was like given that this is the case. I'm not anymore. So for me, fragment and fragmentation might be, of course, considered as negative and purely negative process, but perhaps we should rather focus on fragmentation as on the positive sides of fragmentation and the composition. Thank you.
Yes, I agree, basically. The idea of, in general, when something is broken more or less violently, something happened that many people are nostalgic for the previous situation. I mentioned earlier the French Revolution, so probably most people could consider French Revolution as a good thing in a way. Even when what's happening in general was considered a catastrophe, something very bad. But some decades afterwards, that will consider something positive, because the destruction could be, and this is of course a threat of modernity, the so-called destructive creation, creative destruction. Creative destruction is a fundamental threat of feature of modernity. And this destruction implies something is broken and destroyed. So, for example, probably all of us could agree that the destruction of this linear time, in the idea of progress as the only way for all humanity to the stage, this idea we are all of us critics is not a good idea. So this fragmentation, as you put in rightly, could be something positive. So probably in my presentation I emphasize or stress the drama and the idea that fragmentation is something extremely bad. But and it's very opportune your question to try to nuance a little bit this general impression of my talk.
Thank you. Only to point only one thing, and to insist that there is no uniform we, because I guess that there are a lot of people that are very happy about the metaphors of drama and certain times. I am thinking about, for example, Elon Musk, who is thinking about a beautiful future, excited to exist and to exile from the earth. Not for all persons, not for all we, the metaphors of drama works. Only this I want to point.
Yes, I agree.
Thanks very much. I happened to have lunch with Michael Frieden recently as we were discussing, and he sent me this paper about picking up the pieces, which I haven't picked them up yet, and this has reminded me that I need to read the paper and give him some feedback on it. But I was wondering, so therefore I was wondering. To what degree, just to think about this in terms of the ideology debate, because it seemed to me that what you were suggesting at times was that there was a bit of an end of ideology view to this, that as soon as time as a singular or an idea of universal time becomes increasingly difficult or simply becomes fragmented, that ideological thinking writ large becomes more difficult. So one question is, to what degree do we think ideological thinking and isms requires a broader narrative of history and temporality? And I was thinking about this in the context of, well, this may be true of some ideologies, certainly ideologies that adhere to a clear articulation of history, Marxism, forms of liberalism may struggle, but also in this era of fractured times, some ideologies may thrive. Some ideologies may find that a fractured landscape is more fertile, propitious situations to offer their own visions of the future. And I wanted to know what you thought about that. I was thinking of elements of conservatism, some nationalisms, maybe some green ideologies that view that actually the fracturing of some of these grand narratives aren't bad because it was those grand narratives like progress and development that have led to planetary breakdown. I'll finish. I had the second question, which is, in so many ways, what I read Kozelek as reacting to the problem of the singularization of history, and much of his theorizing on history involves this idea of pluralizing history and thinking of history in terms of plural times. So I was wondering if you had a few comments about the difference between fragmentation and pluralization, and whether or not might we be living in plural times, or are these times pluralized, yet unfortunately they're too pluralized into fragments as opposed to something more put together. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, this is very, very interesting. Yes, my impression is that the breaking up of ideologies and the in particular by identitarian questions related with and the creation of ideologies to pick up the pieces and create a new is a bad thing. So, there's some aspect of fragmentation that could be positive, but undoubtedly there are others that are clearly, for me, could be dangerous, at least, no? It's true that from the French Revolution onwards was the fragmentation of, for example, the apparition of modern ideologies was considered a kind of split of a more or less idealized world where all people share the same beliefs. And from this point of view, the creation of modern ideologies is already a kind of fragmentation, a first way of ideological fragmentation. But now, the destruction of grand narratives, which is a good thing from a point of view, could be dangerous from another, because these fragments of ideologies are picking up in particular by populists and by nationalists. Probably the ideologies more keen and more inclined to use all these debris of ideologies and creating and put together, because nationalism is basically a very strange ideology that could be could be created by using several parts inside it. No? So you mentioned also an important thing related with the pluralization, the difference between fragmentation and pluralization. I would say that in general, almost every category has a positive side and a negative one, and the transvaluation or transvalorization of fragmentation of pluralization could be fragmentation, and vice versa. So if you are using a derogatory discourse about fragmentation, you use the word fragmentation. But if you are, for example, saying that modern ideologies are plural and need to keep plural in order to have a free society, for example, you are using plurality as a positive term. So I remember Thomas Hobbes wrote in the Leviathan, in chapter 3, I think, that people that don't like monarchy call it despotism. So this is in modern language, we have two sides and two terms for every concept, and using it in a positive or negative way. And fragmentation and pluralization probably are the two sides of the same coin.
Thank you very much. That was really stimulating, and I'm following up on the discussion on fragmentation that seems to be developing here. So in terms of metaphors, I think it's really wonderful what you have just showed. I haven't thought about it before, but it's really deeply contradictory. So we have these postmodernist theorists who are coming from the post-structuralist background and, looking at meaning making, at language from the post-structuralist framework point of view, and yet we are using this extremely mechanistic, kind of classical Newtonian metaphor of fragmentation, which is, as other people noticed, is really unsuitable to deal with growing multiplicities, which is what they were facing since, 1960s, 70s, and in the last few decades, as you said. So I'm just curious, why did we stick to this fragmentation when there were other concepts all around and very influential, like, for example, differentiation? So you could look into the species ecology, where differentiation is absolutely necessary to preserve adaptive ability and for survival. Or, for example, if you look at chaos and information theory, then again, differentiation is something that is identified with a viable and structured order. And you lose differentiation when you kind of descend or go into more kind of chaos. Well, it's a debate if it is extreme complexity or if it is deteriorating matter. So differentiation is something that, according from both physics and information theory, describes a viable, functioning, evolving system. So why suddenly fragmentation in this context when there are other ways to think about interdependencies between multiplicities?
I have not a clear answer to your question. I think that differentiation is not is related with fragmentation, but is quite different. So yes, maybe for example, the evolution approach in the Darwinian is something that is not necessarily connected with fragmentation. Fragmentation may be more connected, for example, as Eva pointed out, with the fact of some organic, our corpse as dead people, when we die, we are incorporated into the whole ground and form part of the universe in a way. This is a very Hindu, for example, approach to. So even death is part of the life, and so you can consider that disintegration, decomposition, etc., as positive terms, because in the universe we are all the time creating and new things, but there are a lot of things disappearing. But differentiation is more. I think sociologists have, for example, I remember now Spencer. No, Spencer is probably one of the sociologists of the 19th century who emphasized in particular the idea of evolution, social evolution, as progressive differentiation, a creation of more complex systems. So this is very useful notion for sociologists or for thinking about society and the development. You are right in this sense, but this is all I am able at this time of the of the evening of thinking about.
Yeah, thank you. I just the questions from Ethan and Eva and Blake just got me thinking about Benjamin, and another way to think, to kind of spin this in a positive way, I was thinking of the thesis number 3, where he talks about, I'll quickly read it, not differentiating between major and minor events. Nothing that has ever happened should be regarded as lost for history. To be sure, only a redeemed mankind receives the fullness of its past, which is to say, only for a redeemed mankind has its past become citable in all its moments. So if we think about minor events or those lost moments, and we think of, this idea, I'm talking specifically about this idea that the kind of negative view that we had grand narratives, and now even the criticism we get as historians that it's all very fragmented and we are not doing we've abdicated, from our responsibility. I mean, what this thesis means to me is that in collecting these fragments and the fact that we're recognizing fragments that were not incorporated into the whole, the thing that we mistakenly took for a whole, but that was only actually a fragment in itself. And now this accumulation of further fragments is testimony of our constant state of redeeming ourselves. It's, to not make this, I don't want to read this teleologically in itself and say that there will be a day when we will have the complete record. I don't think that's even how Benjamin meant that. But to me, this would be, and you read that line from Butterfield where he says he also reads fragment in that very positive way as sort of a glimpse into something that we have to kind of assume has been lost, but that should have been redeemed. It's our moral responsibility to sort of redeem it, and that's proof of our self-redemption. So I just thought of that as another way to think about fragmentation and sort of pluralism, as you were saying too, as sort of in a more positive, a sign of being in the right direction, even though I know we're not supposed to have a direction.
Yes, I think you're right. This is another way of approaching the term and the concept of fragmentation. This thesis of Benjamin's thesis is related with is a particular approach related with messianism and the idea of emancipation and the creation. It's a kind of very dark moment in history, and he's trying to change completely the losers and the defeated and the victims of history must be raised. So this idea that in some particular moments, and this is connected, of course, with his theory of Shahzad, and the idea that certain points in time are able to attract past opportunities lost. And this is a very poetic, at the same time, quite fertile approach, because it's completely different, as you rightly point out, of the traditional vision of history as something teleological and linear, etc. The creation of certain moments in time is related, of course, with Ethan and other approaches, trying to put together several, not just this division strict between past, present, and future. And of course, even in modern times, one of the characteristics of modern history, and in particular the philosophies of history, is that any philosophy of history is using the past for the future. This is a characteristic of modernity, no? The future is the North Pole, and so even you are emphasizing such or such past, this is the past who is able to bring you to your goal, to the telos you are facing in advance. So in a way, the future commands the past, no? But the approach by Benjamin is completely different, because even he's in the middle of Marxism and the Messianic Judaism, trying to manage this tradition. He is emphasizing a completely different of the modern, and this is the reason why he's so read in recent decades. No? Benjamin was forgotten, and from just as you know, last 2 or 3 decades he has raised, and all of us are reading his texts.
One last question. Okay. Seeing no other hands, I'll jump in. My question repeats themes that have already come up, but from maybe a different perspective, since I'm not by profession a historian. A work that influenced my own thinking a great deal was Lois, from Hegel to Nietzsche, right, where the arc of the 19th century is just the arc of, right, comprehension of the world, as a rational object. History is as rational to fragmentation. And so maybe the most straightforward way to put, are we just repeating, is this movement from, we are dominated by a certain hegemonic view of things to, oh my gosh, there is no order anywhere. Is this just, are we just repeating ourselves, that this movement says something more about us as cognitive creatures than about history in any particular sense?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think there are particular moments in history when the disoriented people are in need of some kind of orientation. This is our moment also, and this is also the Hegel times. No, Hegel started his philosophy of history, his lessons, with a reflection about transition. So he was perfectly aware that he was living, not just he, but all the European people were living through troubled times, with no very clear route or goal. And he used the metaphor of I don't remember, rayo, ¿cómo se dice en inglés? Rayo, relámpago. Rain, no. When in a storm, something lightning. The lightning, which is used, Hegel, this is a kind of lightning. In the dark, we can see where we are heading. So in a way, Hegel was very aware that he was offering to his readers a kind of orientation in order to see for a moment the future, the past of humanity and the future. So this is, I think that probably in our troubled times, we are living through another moment of perplexity, another time of disorientation. And this is the reason because why we we have some politicians not very trying to magic, using the magic wand and saying this is very, very easy this is. So they are using for example, in the States, is using the old repository of resources. No, for example, obviously Trump using the MAGA is something related with we make America great again, or Brexit. No, the same. I don't remember now the slogan of the Brexit. No, but this take back control or something like. So, yeah, this is a lot of slogans in a moment of people need to and are very eager to take these kinds of magic solutions to problems, etc. No? This is a little melancholic conclusion.